Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Thyroid Eye Disease, Today's Treatments, Tomorrow's Research, and How to Take Action. My name is Kira Baldonado, and I am the Executive Vice President at Prevent Blindness, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm a middle-aged woman with some strawberry blonde hair, glasses, and I'm sitting in my office with a patterned gray wall behind me with a picture in the background. Today, we'll learn about how current treatments for thyroid eye disease, also known as TED, work in the eye, what types of clinical research are underway, and how to talk with your doctor about the right care for you. We'll also review steps to identify and get involved with clinical trials. I would like to take a moment to thank Amgen for sponsoring this event. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce our panelists for this webinar, Dr. Trevor Angell and Richie Kahn. Dr. Trevor Angell is an Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine and Associate Medical Director of the Thyroid Center in the Division of Endocrinology and Diabetes at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. As a TED specialist, Dr. Angell will provide an overview of how current treatments work in the eye, what types of clinical research are underway, and how to talk with a doctor about your care. Our second panelist is Richie Kahn. Richie is a co-founder and Chief Operating Officer of Canary Advisors. He will share how to identify and get involved in clinical trials. And please note that the information shared in this webinar is for educational purposes only. It's not intended to serve as medical advice or to endorse any sort of specific treatment or product. Always consult with your healthcare provider for personalized medical guidance before making any decisions regarding your health or treatment options. We encourage you to reach out to a qualified medical professional who can address your individual needs. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Angell.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. My name is Trevor Angell. I won't repeat the rest. I'm a man, light skin, glasses, short black hair, and I have a blurred background with a fake tree behind me. And I'm going to talk about thyroid eye disease, really building to what is clinical research, clinical trials all about, and what should you be thinking about to take action. But in order to do that, I want to at least take a little bit of a step back as, to talk about the condition, how it's assessed, what is, sort of the treatment landscape today, to sort of facilitate thinking about when and how you would take that jump towards a clinical trial. So what is thyroid eye disease? So we'd consider it a chronic autoimmune related condition, usually associated with thyroid disorders, either Graves' disease that causes hyperthyroidism in the majority of cases, but sometimes associated with Hashimoto's disease, which is usually associated with an underactive thyroid or hypothyroidism, but is still autoimmune. And then sometimes thyroid eye disease can really present in isolation without thyroid problems at all. What happens is that there are inflammatory changes behind the eye that really lead to the symptoms and signs. So here's an image of a person who might be manifesting a lot of what we see with thyroid eye disease. So as a doctor, we're looking at the enlargement of the eyes. We're looking at swelling around the eyes, and we can see that the brow is a bit furrowed, which can be, a manifestation of light sensitivity or just general discomfort. The eyes are a little bit red, maybe because of dryness, chronic irritation because the lids won't close. And so all of those we're just seeing. And then we might assess the vision. Is there any vision loss or double vision, diplopia, because the eyes can no longer move the way they should because of the inflammation behind the eye. Patients might complain of dryness or irritation by itself. They may notice the enlargement. If there isn't adequate protection, there can be corneal problems, abrasions, or alterations, double vision, as I mentioned, and then ultimately what we really don't want is people who are actually having vision loss. How does this happen? It's really a function of an antibody directed against the TSH receptor. And TSH receptor is very much expressed on the thyroid, which is why this is typically associated with a thyroid problem. And shown here on the left is a immune cell, a B cell. They make antibodies, so sort of like little blue triangles. And behind the eye, in the middle, are sort of cells that express the receptor for TSH also. So this antibody can bind there. Coupled with that is a different receptor for insulin growth factor 1 or IGF-1, which is another signal. And together, these, when they're stimulated by the antibody, cause growth of the tissues and inflammation and bring in immune cells. This little green circle, blue circle, yellow circle, representing lots of different cell types that are going to be expanded and inflame the area behind the eye. And so that inflammation leads to, this enlargement of the tissue, disruption of normal function, pushing the eye forward, all of the manifestations that we see. So thinking about, aspects of a medical visit for thyroid eye disease, and how are we going to get from, clinical care to clinical trials? We really want to assess the severity of thyroid eye disease. And that can be the activity of inflammation or the severity of the protrusion, the proptosis, the enlargement of the eyes. That's important because someone who has very few symptoms, a clinical trial may offer more risks than benefits. On the far other end of the spectrum, someone who presents with active vision loss, where we know an urgent intervention might save their vision, they also, the risk of trying something experimental might be too great. And so right now, it is often patients in the middle who have a substantial burden of symptoms, but the optimal treatment is less certain, where we're going to think the most about the benefits of a newer treatment that may offer something more effective, less side effects, or a combination of both. So thinking about those medical treatment that are available, and I'll talk a little bit more about those, versus maybe surgical treatments that someone might utilize. Medical treatments decrease inflammation. A surgical treatment may be more related to appearance, where maybe the eyelids are contracted and they can be released and make the appearance of the face more normal, but it's not as much a vision issue. And then all of that kind of leading to thinking about clinical trials. So what is today's landscape? Looking at someone who has thyroid eye disease, and maybe it's on the mild side. So number one, we would treat someone's thyroid problem. If they have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, we want to normalize thyroid hormone levels. That can help. Two, and something very important on the screen, is a X'd out cigarette, which is, stopping smoking is very important to reducing thyroid eye disease severity. There may be some other, practical measures that have some evidence and are quite safe. So statin use, the same things that lower cholesterol, have some association with improving the inflammation of thyroid eye disease. And also supplementation with the micronutrient selenium has been shown to improve mild eye disease. So these may be some things to consider. Also, when we think about clinical trials, we start to think about what are they trying to prove and what gets in the way. So maybe taking a statin or taking selenium is something that they don't allow in the clinical trial because they don't want something else interfering with whether or not they can see if the drug's working or if something else is working. And so it's a good idea in that sense to think about clinical trials early because there are these easy measures, but you don't necessarily know how they're going to impact uh, other options. Then there's what we call more moderate to severe thyroid eye disease. So those people are going to have more inflammation, worse eye enlargement, and they're going to be really current medical and surgical treatments that we would think about. Thinking more on the medical side first. So this slide I've put back up here what I showed originally about how the disease uh, happens. We have the immune cells and then all of the cells in the back of the eye that become inflamed. So for a long time, steroids, anti-inflammatory steroids, have been given by IV intravenously. And what they do is they really interrupt the inflammation that exists behind the eye, all of those inflammatory signals. And so they help with inflammation over a relatively short period of time, but can definitely improve all of the symptoms. They don't address necessarily the antibody production by the B cells on the far left. And why might it be less favorable? Well, there's side effects like elevated blood sugar. Overall, the duration of how long it might be beneficial is not permanent. The newer treatment, which is FDA approved, is called Teprotumumab or Tepezza. And right in the middle there is written IGF-1 receptor. And it's an antibody against this receptor that participates in the antibody binding to the TSH receptor. Sorry about that noise. And so what it does is it decreases that inflammation, that tissue enlargement, and improves the proptosis. That was the main outcome of the clinical trials, but has a number of benefits, and is the only FDA approved agent. There have been concerns about hyperglycemia, hearing impairment, which is at least temporary, and other side effects. And again, how long it lasts and other things make it potentially not optimal. So that's where we come to always wanting, more options and better options for patients, and finding new agents to investigate, right? So what is being looked at? So let's start at the very beginning. Agents that could eliminate the B cells making the TSH receptor antibodies. The antibodies themselves, so an agent that would get rid of those antibodies from the circulation before they can go to the back of the eye and start doing damage. And then again, agents that block the IGF-1 receptor, maybe in alternative ways to the way that the current agent works. And then directly blocking the TSH receptor, which is the other really player in the problem. So those would all be examples of different medications that are being tried or are in the pipeline to come into clinical trials. Additionally, you could find clinical trials that would be sort of considered post-initial approval. So we might take a agent that exists and is currently given as an infusion and try a different way to give it. Maybe that's a subcutaneous injection, the way insulin is given, or weight loss medication nowadays. Or asking, is how much does someone need to get the benefit? So do they need a full course or is it a reduced course? Should it be given on the same schedule or can it be given less frequently or more frequently? And does that optimize the benefits and maximally reduce the risks? So those sorts of clinical trials can exist also. So keeping that in mind in terms of thyroid eye disease, let's turn to just thinking about involvement in clinical trials, and some fundamentals and important things to know about. So firstly, phases of drug development and clinical trials are important to consider. Preclinical studies have always gone on before anything gets anywhere close to a clinical trial with humans that have involved essentially, years of work of molecule discovery and testing in cells and other animals. Phase 1 studies are typically small, often involving healthy volunteers, really to look at a safety of an agent. Phase 2 studies are slightly larger, and again, really focus on side effects and safety with some outcomes related to efficacy. Phase 3 studies are really where we get to large scale clinical trials where people are doing it from a number of different sites, and it's the gold standard for, is this an effective study and what is the most we can know about it, that typically leads to FDA approval for the drug to be used clinically. And then it might be studied again after that, as I was mentioning, that would be called phase 4. Talking about the timeline of these, I was mentioning that discovery and preclinical trial takes years. Clinical trials often will take years depending on the details and the condition. And then FDA review of the data that comes from that, to make sure that it's satisfactory for approval will take time, and then eventually to market. So there are estimates that this process takes, 10 to 15 years, roughly $1 to $2 billion. And we associate clinical trials very strongly with pharmaceutical companies, and they take risk and expend a lot of money to try and make this a reality, to benefit patients, and also, as part of the way our pharmaceutical system works. I think it's important to know that the massive proportion of discovery is publicly funded. This is NIH funded work to universities that really has so much risk that even private companies don't take it on. And ultimately, these discoveries are translated down the road to things that pharmaceutical companies can work with. FDA review is a publicly run system of oversight. And so, thinking about clinical trials, there is a public-private relationship, and there is, an important component that is outside of pharmaceutical companies that, helps control and watch over what's being done. And to that end, there are a few federal patient protections that go into every clinical trial that exists. And this would be the requirement to disclose risks and benefits, that participation is voluntary, that there's always a right to withdraw, and that there are confidentiality protections. And to go against this is to risk, being banned from being able to work with the FDA on doing clinical trials, which no one wants to risk. I'll point this out in a little bit more detail in the context of California, which is where I'm from, but it's going to be very similar in other states. So what do you want to know, right? Really, what is on this list is I think very fundamental. What is the purpose of the study? What are the procedures or the drug that's being used in the study? What risks are reasonably expected? What benefits are reasonably expected? What alternatives are there? What is the standard option likely to work, or do we have no good other options? That's important to know. What is the availability of medical treatments if there's a side effect or a complication from this study? Okay. And then I think other things, there's the opportunity to ask questions, voluntary withdrawal at any time, that you're given a copy of the consent, and that your consent is given without coercion. Those are, I think, just sort of obvious and important aspects of research, but they're really ironclad in the world today. So why be in a clinical trial? I've tried to kind of maybe touch on this in several places. You know, if you're looking at a condition where the current treatments are suboptimal, either because they're not as efficacious as we would like them to be, or they have greater risks or side effects. And if we have something that we're testing that we reasonably think could be better for people, if the alternatives available are few, right? These are the times to really advocate for the possibility of a clinical trial. If someone is doing fine and there's a treatment that works amazingly, someone may have a mind towards trying something new, but you would question how much you wanted to take that on. So what about getting involved with clinical trials? You're going to do some detective work, as this little Sherlock Holmes woman in the corner of the screen is advocating. What questions would you want to ask? Why is this study being done? Right? What is the hope? What phase is it? That's important to consider. We talked about, what those different times might be. What kind of patient is being enrolled? What are the criteria? Who is it meant to benefit? Do I fit that mold? What is the funding source? I mean, certainly a lot of these are going to be pharmaceutical funding, obviously, and that's honestly reassuring. If there isn't a very clear, robust funder, then maybe not something to get involved with. Of course, what are the expected risks and benefits? And then the last one I'll point out, very important, is thinking about what's involved. It's not just the medication and the side effects, but what does this study require? How often are the visits? Where are they located? How much time do they take? What procedures am I going to have to go through each time? And costs, what parts of this does the study pay for? And what's going to be considered part of the routine care that's still going to be billed to you or your insurance company? That distinction does exist. I'll end by just mentioning about finding clinical trials. There are a lot of good ways to do this, and you can hear more about it. There's something called clinicaltrials.gov. I even hesitate to try and figure out what's, finding things easily in this website. But it is where everything has to be listed, has to show the public what's going on. Google's not a bad source, particularly because it tends to show you things that are in your geographic area, because it knows everything. If you are seeing an expert physician, that's obviously a great resource to try and work with. Maybe even, AI, ChatGPT can help curate things for us. I will just put in a plug for the Graves' Disease and Thyroid Foundation, and I think the link will be available. They do a nice job curating open clinical trials for both thyroid eye disease and Graves' disease. But I found that a nice resource that's patient-friendly in terms of the content there. So important to identify your thyroid eye disease and its severity, to get information about the possibility of clinical trials maybe early and how they fit into what you need, and then really having the best information about what being part of a clinical trial entails. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Angell. That was a great presentation, and it's exciting to consider the evolution of treatments for TED that already exist. but also where we're headed to in the future with some new options. So right now, I'd like to bring Richie back into the screen here. And Richie, you represent a patient advocate who brings lived experience in this space and a strong voice for patients into research conversations. So Richie, you have a unique combination of perspectives for our conversation. You're a public health professional, clinical research professional, a patient advocate as a person living with a rare vision condition. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and how all these different roles came together for you to guide others and educating them about clinical trials.
Hello, everybody. Thanks to the Prevent Blindness team and Dr. Angell for the invitation to join today's discussion. My name is Richie Kahn. I am a white man with dark hair, a salt and pepper beard, wearing a plaid button-up shirt, and I am dialing in from my home office with a white virtual background with a yellow canary on it. So, how did I get here? I am a public health professional by training. I fell into clinical research about 16 years ago. And believe it or not, I was working in ophthalmology, working to develop new treatments for eye diseases back in 2019, when I learned, much to my surprise and chagrin, that I am going blind myself due to a rare and orphan form of optic atrophy. I made the pivot at that point, started my own business, which is designed to help better ensure that patient perspectives, patient wants and needs are incorporated into drug development. So hopefully the clinical trials created are not only a good fit for what you want to need, but also less burdensome than they would be otherwise. So it was a little bit kismet, some luck perhaps, that I was able to combine all of these different skills, the work I was doing in drug development with my background in public health and advocacy. And I've made it really my mission the last 6 or 7 years to focus on, like I said, better incorporating community wants and needs into drug development over at Canary Advisors.
That's critical. That's going to make all of these future solutions even better for the target audience. Now, I've had the pleasure of knowing you for a few years now, but I have heard you say that people often wonder why they should even participate in a clinical trial if it's not going to lead to a cure. But why are clinical trials important, not just for science, but for patients and families?
Great question. I'll start with the high level and then I'll answer personally because I'm in that particular situation myself. So next time you go to the pharmacy, I would encourage everyone to kind of get a sense of all of the different prescriptions and over-the-counter products for that matter on the shelf. None of them are possible without testing in real live humans. For all of the prescribed products, medical devices, that testing is a clinical trial, right? So clinical trials and scientific breakthroughs are not possible without patients like each of us on the line. Thinking back to Dr. Angell's presentation when he was talking about the phases of research, talking about the phase 1 studies, I was just talking with a friend earlier today. Those are the first in human trials where we are really focused on gathering some really preliminary data that's critically important to informing drug development. Almost 90% of the time, if we're involved in a phase 1 trial ourselves, we're not going to see any benefit or observe any meaningful difference. But when I think about clinical research and the 3 or 4 trials I've been involved in myself, I wasn't necessarily expecting a benefit. I am a public health person, as I mentioned. I am not necessarily a hard scientist, but I really like the idea of contributing to science, generating some knowledge that can be generalized to the broader population, and doing what I can to contribute, especially to rare disease research. Thinking about myself, I have an ultra rare condition where there is not any approved therapy right now. There is not a clinical trial that I qualify for, but I am quite confident if and when the clinical trial is broadened where I can participate, even if I'm not necessarily likely to benefit, I am absolutely going to reach out to the clinical trial site to learn more about what's involved, because I really am passionate about advancing science. So there are a lot of reasons to get involved in research. Maybe you're passionate about science. Maybe you're looking to achieve better outcomes yourself. And certainly, I think the access to care that's often above and beyond what most of us get is also a very valid and understandable driver.
Yeah. And I think all of us want to be able to leave something a little bit better for the people after us. So it's another great way to do that. But sometimes the words clinical trial can be scary to some people. Maybe they have concerns or misconceptions about it. Maybe they've heard something that wasn't positive from another person. What have you heard? And how can you help reassure?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is there needs to be an industry-wide education and awareness campaign. If you go to the grocery store and you start talking to the cashier about clinical trials, pretty good chance we're not going to necessarily know what you're talking about. There is definitely broader awareness and knowledge during COVID, but I find this awareness kind of ebbs and flows. So, a couple things I would say in terms of misconceptions or concerns. Dr. Angel spoke to informed consent earlier. There are multiple layers of patient protections to keep those participating in research safe. There are institutional review boards in the US and ethics committees in pretty much every country that make sure that the only trials allowed in your community are ones that are based on good, sound science that are designed to keep patients safe while increasing scientific knowledge that can be, again, generalized to the broader population, making sure those are the only trials being conducted. So, understanding that we have those protections in place, I think it's really important to understand that when you participate in a clinical trial, nothing is ever going to be done to you without your permission, without your consent. It's also important to understand just because you've given your consent to screen and participate at the beginning, you are well within your right to drop out at any time for any reason. So that's the really big thing I wanted to mention. There are patient protections. Everything is being done according to a clinical trial protocol or a playbook. So various assessments are being done for very valid, well-studied scientific reasons. They're not being done kind of willy-nilly. They're all being done to generate that information we need to make faster go or no-go decisions about do we move ahead with the next phase of clinical research.
Yeah, that's reassuring. Now, one thing we often hear about pretty much everything is it takes a village. So we need to see that in research as well. So let's talk about who often is or isn't represented in research and why it's important for clinical trials to include people from diverse communities and how can patients advocate for themselves to make sure they are represented?
Great question, Karen. One of my favorite topics. Historically, clinical trials have not been nearly as representative as they need to be. There has been a movement in recent years, particularly over the last 6 or 8, we've seen some progress to really make sure that clinical trials have diversity action plans in advance. So, plans to make sure that those participating are representative of the larger population, to make sure not everyone participating looks like me, comes from my town, has my background. You think about it, right? If clinical trials are only available in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they're only available between 9 and 3, Monday through Thursday, you have an access issue. You have an issue around who has the ability to take off work, who can find childcare, who can find reliable transportation. So, one of the things being done in recent years is definitely a move to bring clinical trials to where the community is, right? So there are opportunities to participate from where you are, whether that's at home, from your office, the break room, using technologies like decentralized clinical trial tools. So you can participate using telemedicine. I think many of us have probably had telemedicine visits. You can collect data using wearables like smartwatches and devices like smartphones. The idea is, in order to participate, you no longer have to travel several hours to a clinical trial site multiple times every couple weeks. So, accessibility is important in that regard. I think it's also really important to be mindful of not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but accessibility specifically in clinical research. So, thinking about myself, I'm legally blind. I don't drive. I live in Durham, North Carolina. I am about 4 blocks away from Duke University Medical Center. Seems good. However, we don't have good public transportation. It is not a very pedestrian friendly route. So if I want to participate in research, Duke is going to have to be flexible about the means by which I can participate, whether it's telemedicine, providing transportation, having flexible hours. But all of these things taken together, especially when talking to the community about what they would need to remove burdens and barriers to participation, can result in a trial that's more representative of the broader population and more accessible for all.
That's critical. There's so much to be thinking about beyond just developing the new treatment, but how can we get people to the clinical trial itself? So as the clinical trial is conducted, we want to make sure that people understand what the impacts are of the clinical trial. So how is information shared from the clinical trial with the public? How can we hear about these things?
Yeah. So information is shared with the public in a couple different ways at a couple different time points. So after a clinical trial has been completed, data has been analyzed, there is a requirement that pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies, the firms running these clinical trials, post results on clinicaltrials.gov. It often happens, it's not necessarily as timely as we would like, but clinicaltrials.gov is one good place to find this information. Often sponsors, again, pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies will communicate with the community through community letters, through webinars like this, through sponsored sessions at advocacy workshops. And they will often do that at a corresponding time point with when they're putting out updates to investors or the broader community. And these updates tend to be provided in partnership with advocacy in patient-friendly language, really focused on the information that's going to be most meaningful to us, right? So if it's a public company, it's not necessarily pertinent that we hear about their financial performance or their long-term view on how much capital they have to conduct research for a couple of years. We want to know what did the data show? What is the top line takeaway? So that's a good resource. And one thing I'll mention, we're talking about resources later, but organizations like SysGrip, who we'll talk about in a moment, do a really good job of communicating plain language clinical trial summaries. Often these summaries are done in partnership with companies like Amgen, but they're an excellent way of staying current on the clinical research updates.
That's excellent. So not a lot of people are familiar with those, so that's very useful. So beyond the medical side of a clinical trial, what are some of the other sort of real life considerations that you need to think about for yourself as you consider a clinical trial, but how they're supported maybe through the trial?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest one I'd say, and this is kind of the overarching answer, then we'll drill down a little bit, is I always encourage people to think about how does this clinical trial fit into my life, right? So if you are going somewhere like Duke and you work 9 to 5, probably not going to flexible scheduling. So maybe that trial doesn't fit into your life. If you are going to a research facility in the community, how are you going to get there? Is there public transit? Do you have a reliable vehicle? Scheduling, again, is important. Do you have the ability to take time off from work? Maybe you've got kids at home who require childcare. I know I've got 2 dogs behind me here who require a pet sitter or at least someone to let them out and walk them. And then, depending on the particulars, if you are traveling for an extended period of time, say for a gene therapy trial where you may be away from home for weeks or months, what's that going to look like? Who's going to take care of, again, the home, the kiddos, the dogs? Is there a need for a care partner or a loved one to travel with you? If so, that's often considered and paid for by the sponsor of the trial. But then it becomes a question of making sure that the trial fits that loved one's schedule as well, right? And the final thing I would mention, while travel and lodging are typically booked for you by the company paying for the clinical trial, there are often costs that we have to submit for reimbursement for, right? So if you are driving to the clinic or a loved one's driving you to the clinic and you have to pay for parking, it could be $15, $20. If the clinical trial site is an hour or two away from home, that's gas, that's wear and tear on the car. These are things you're going to have to submit for and wait on reimbursement, unfortunately. So at Canary and Canary Concierge specifically, we try to prepay and pre-book as much as we can, but these are some things that you can't necessarily pay for in advance. So want to be mindful of the costs and the impact on your day-to-day, your work life, your home life, and how the trial fits in generally, and all of the above.
Those are important considerations. So good to have a conversation with those loved ones that'll be supporting you in a clinical trial. Now, Dr. Angell shared some tips on how to find a clinical trial, and you mentioned CSCRIP as well. Do you have any other tips for finding a clinical trial to share with our audience?
Yeah. So first to clarify, CSCRIP is the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. I know we'll be sharing the CSCRIP link in the resources. So that is one great opportunity. Uh, Going direct to advocacy organizations is really impactful. Often they will have a clinical trial listing or a clinical trial registry. Sometimes they'll have a really cool little widget on their website, which is called trial matching. So you can click on that little widget. You can enter where you're based, if it's going to be an in-person trial, your diagnosis, your age, perhaps. You answer a handful of questions, usually no more than 7 or 8, and then you can get a curated list of clinical trials near you or relevant to your interests. The last one I will mention, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Patients want to learn about clinical trials from a trusted source of medical information. The problem is there's a bit of a disconnect where even though Dr. Angell is very familiar with clinical trials, I think something like 1/5 of 1% of the time you talk to a clinician, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, they're going to bring up clinical research as a care option. And it's not because they're not in support. It's not because they think there's anything wrong with the research. Often providers don't participate in research themselves because they don't know how to get involved. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the infrastructure. So if you learn about a clinical trial, if you review some information about a clinical trial, feel free to bring it to your provider, to your clinician to have that conversation, because they will definitely be able to talk about the science a little bit. They'll be able to talk about your particular condition and whether it makes sense maybe to take a further look at that clinical trial as a care option.
That's excellent. Now, as we close, what's one piece of advice or encouragement that you would share with someone who's curious about clinical trials, but maybe still isn't ready to start one?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, always advocate for yourself. You are going to advocate for yourself better than anyone else is going to. If you're considering research or even a new treatment method, ask questions and don't stop asking questions until you're satisfied with the information. Before you participate in a trial, you want to be able to comfortably make an informed and educated decision. And with that in mind, participation is going to vary. It's going to look different for everybody. Maybe you say, look, I'm interested in a trial, but I don't have the time or the bandwidth to go into a clinical trial site. I want to participate from home. I want to do something that's maybe observational and not interventional. It's really going to vary, but make sure you get your questions answered. You're satisfied with the information shared, and you have a good understanding of not only what to expect of the clinical trial you're participating in, but what's expected of you as well.
Excellent. A lot of great tips through this entire conversation. Thank you, Richie. And I'm going to bring you back in just a couple of minutes for our Q&A. There we go. Thank you. They're getting my slides ready for me, making me look good. So one of the first resources that I want to mention is just our Thyroid Eye Disease webpage on the Prevent Blindness website, preventblindness.org. So these fact sheets provide information about thyroid eye disease, living with the condition, resources, connections, but also considerations for your quality of life. They're available in English and Spanish, and they're a great resource to give to your family and friends to help them understand what you may be living with thyroid eye disease. Our next resource is our Focus on Eye Health Expert Series. So we have 2 videos which focus on thyroid eye disease, one TED and mental wellness, because there is certainly a connection with your mental wellness and the condition of thyroid eye disease. And the other one is TED and the TED community. So the TED community is a resource that helps individuals with thyroid eye disease. And I think on the next slide, we have the link for there we go. Thank you. We have a link for the TED community. And we have watched this community grow, and they're doing some great programming, really a range of activities and ways that you can get involved with others living with thyroid eye disease. Our next resource is the Aspect Patient Engagement Program. That's actually how Richie and I got to know each other. The Aspect Patient Engagement Program is Prevent Blindness's signature program that aims to equip individuals who live with vision loss and blindness, as well as allies for those individuals, providing knowledge, skills, and confidence to become advocates for vision and eye health, advocating at the individual level, state or local level, and even the federal and legislative level. Participants learn to share their own story of their vision journey and meet others who have or care for those with different vision disorders or eye diseases. Individuals graduating from the program learn how to leverage their stories to improve vision and eye health, practice, policies, programs, or even research. Another resource Prevent Blindness offers is the Living Well with Low Vision resource. It's a web-based resource for patients, caregivers, and health professionals to help educate about the loss of vision, to help individuals meet the daily challenges that result from it, as well as the care providers. And the website includes personal guides, support group connections, a transportation service provider by zip code, a clinical trial finder, and much more. And then looking at the Prevent Blindness clinical trials webpage specifically, we do have a range of ways to identify clinical trials and a great overview of what clinical trials are, sort of reiterating some of the information you've heard today about different phases, your rights during a clinical trial, and others. And then there are 3 ways to find clinical trials on this page. There's a link by different conditions. You can simply click and it'll take you to the clinicaltrials.gov pre-curated for that condition. There's the widget that Richie talked about on that webpage, or if you're feeling ambitious, there's a link to clinicaltrials.gov and you can start your own search there. And then a couple of other resources that have been mentioned. The Graves' Disease and Thyroid Foundation has that great clinical trials page as well, which has different clinical trials that are underway, recruiting, or full, but you can keep an eye on their outcomes. And then finally, Richie mentioned CISCRP, so the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, and they do have a library of easy to understand resources on clinical research, so you can really learn more about all things clinical trials there. So all of these will be sent to you. The presentation will be sent to you, so don't worry about copying down those websites. You'll have links to those after the presentation. But with that, I'd like to bring back our panelists for our Q&A. I do have a few to start with myself. So I'm actually going to start with Dr. Angell with a question. One of the questions that we've had that came in from the participants is how stress plays a role on exacerbating symptoms of thyroid eye disease. Can you talk a little bit about individuals who may have some stress related to the condition and what impact that may have on the progression of the disease itself?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. It's a very good question. With respect to sort of the onset of the condition or an exacerbation of the condition, we think that stress definitely causes or has a role. And the reason is, I think anecdotally, we've had the experience of people who really report, stressful events, and then eyes started to change, or the development of hyperthyroidism came shortly thereafter. There's also more epidemiologic studies, right? If you take populations that were exposed to relatively high stress, like a war zone, and sort of the incidence of thyroid problems, particularly so Graves' disease or thyroid eye disease, after that, there seems to be some role in the development of it. I don't think we've worked out exactly what the key steps are, but if we think about the problem being one of the immune system, being one of inflammation, it's reasonable to start to think about a connection there. Now, reducing stress in one's life is never a bad idea, but just because we know that doesn't mean that we necessarily can say, oh, we're going to prescribe that reducing stress or anything like that is an effective treatment for this condition. We haven't necessarily proven that, but certainly I would not. I would avoid good sleep and healthy diet and exercise and mindfulness to anybody anyway.
Exactly. Taking up medication or meditation couldn't be the worst thing to do at this point in time. So, Richie, for you, we had a question that came in asking about how individuals with thyroid eye disease can move away from sort of being research subjects to being true partners and shaping pharmaceutical research. I know that's something that you think about every day.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite topics. So the FDA has a mechanism for doing this. It's called patient-focused drug development. And they are really, really, really committed to hearing from all of us about unmet needs, quality of life impacts, preferences. There are about 13 different ways you can share that information. And almost all of these ways are compensated, right? Because patient time is very valuable. You've got other things going on. So thinking about the compensated methods first, I'll give you a couple. Focus groups, getting involved in advisory boards. These things are typically run by drug companies to make sure that they have a good understanding of the lived experience of individuals with thyroid eye disease, for example. You get paid fair market value for your time and your insights in this work. A lot of this work can be done virtually from home, often on Zoom. You don't necessarily have to travel across the country there. There are opportunities to get involved in qualitative research, in interviews, in surveys. All of those opportunities are compensated. Now, there are ones that are advocacy led that are not compensated, but they're every much as important, if not more so. So things like patient listening sessions and externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. Patient listening sessions are held on Zoom like this, invite only, handful of speakers, and FDA listens, and you simply share your lived experience. Really important, though not compensated, it goes a long way towards educating and informing the FDA about community wants and needs. Often the next step from that, instead of a 90-minute virtual meeting, is what they call an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. These might be in person. Often they're hybrid, where there are people in the room, there are people participating virtually. You can get involved in advance by providing answers to surveys. You can get involved as a speaker during the meeting. You can get involved in a panel discussion. You can submit comments after the meeting. However you get involved during an ELPFDD, everything is written up and summarized in a voice of the patient report. And this is a document along with the recording from that session that will live in perpetuity on the advocacy organization's website, FDA's website, and it will be all of these things actually are to be consulted when drug companies are looking to develop new treatments for thyroid eye disease, and as regulators like the FDA are evaluating new treatments for thyroid eye disease. Last thing I'll say in that regard, I mentioned the FDA is really, really committed here. When a drug company submits their file for review, when they're asking to be approved to market their new product, the FDA says, did you get involved in patient experience data collection? There's an actual tick box, yes or no. Hopefully you've said yes. And then hopefully when you get to the next form and they say, what did you do? How did it influence your work? There's going to be a lot to say about how patient experience was incorporated to remove unnecessary burdens and barriers to clinical research participation and to make sure the outcomes of interest are a good fit for not only regulatory needs, scientific interests, but community needs as well.
That's
A
excellent.
lot of options.
We had a follow-up question, so this may be helpful. How do you find these opportunities for advisory boards or PFDDs or other opportunities you spoke about?
Yeah. So you've got a couple options for the ELPFTDs and listening sessions. You can take a look at FDA's website. You can see what's scheduled. If you're already plugged in with an advocacy organization, if there's going to be a meeting for thyroid eye disease, for example, you're probably gonna hear from them. You'll get a webinar invite or you'll get an email. For the advisory boards and focus groups, those tend to be sponsored, as I said, by pharmaceutical companies. You might send an email to it could be info@canaryadvisors.com or whatever the email address is. Even if it's not the right place, they'll get you connected to the right people, often patient advocacy or patient affairs.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr.
Yeah.
Angell, no, we had a question that came in about, how common is it for somebody with thyroid eye disease to go blind? So you said that sometimes vision problems emerge because of different symptoms and things that happen, but is blindness common with thyroid eye disease?
Sure. Well, fortunately, it isn't common. And depending on talking about blindness in terms of absolute or on a spectrum, total blindness would certainly be rare. About 5% of thyroid eye disease is, sight threatening, meaning that someone would have some loss of visual acuity, mostly relating to damage to the optic nerve because of its location, behind the eye. And then fortunately, we can treat some of that and reverse it, not all of it, and certainly not without treatment. Now, the presence of double vision and the ability to see adequately because of that is going to be an additional, source of vision loss, whether or not someone would put that in the camp of blindness or not, right? And so that's going to start to affect it, considerably more patients. But fortunately, we're not talking about the majority of patients with thyroid eye disease in terms of blindness. As opposed to maybe some of the like variety of other eye-related symptoms or problems.
Excellent. So keep up with your visits to your doctor, talk to them about any changes in vision, and maintain those treatments as prescribed. So all good reminders. Any final words for our audience today? And I'll start with Richie and then Dr. Angell.
Really appreciative of everyone taking the time to join in this evening's conversation. Definitely encourage you to learn more about clinical research participation, and don't be afraid to get involved. It's actually pretty enjoyable, and you can play a part in developing new treatments for thyroid eye disease.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great.
Dr.
Yeah,
Angell?
I want to say thank you to the people listening. Thank you to Prevent Blindness. I think this is a very exciting space right now in terms of clinical trials and options. And someone's thyroid eye disease may have been overlooked or may have fallen to the back burner, in an era when there wasn't a lot to do about it. So it is a great time to potentially revisit, where someone is, because things are changing so fast.
Indeed. Well, thank you to both of you, Richie, Dr. Angell, for being here today, for providing this great information for our audience. So thank you and have a great evening.